After my last video discussing amalgams, it got me thinking of alien fusions again. Since the introduction in Season 2 of the classic series, fusions have become pretty intimately linked to Ben 10 as a franchise, as well as the community just wholeheartedly working non-stop creating new and interesting takes on alien fusions. Outside of Ben 10 and predating it, my initial introduction to fusions as a concept came with Goten and Trunks' Gotenks form. Otherwise, if we're talking about other childhood examples of my early introduction to fusions, Yu-Gi-Oh comes to mind. But we'll touch on the concept of fusion more generally later on. Back to Ben 10 proper. We've got a few iterations of fusion in series to go over. There's the mismatched, interesting but somewhat unfortunate ones that pop up in Classic, as well as the array of fusions that pop up with Omniverse's iteration of Ben 10,000 using his biometrics, which had me reminiscing about the countless hours I spent on Ben 10 DNA Lab, which, if you're unfamiliar, was this great little game on Cartoon Network's website which let you to fuse two aliens together and get some pretty solid results. This being a well-needed and quite surprising, wildly in-depth follow-up after fusions were introduced in Dr. Animo and the Mutant Ray. I remember first using DNA Lab back when it was first released. I couldn't have been any older than 8 at the time, not realising that all of these designs were made up by Tom Perkins, thinking it was all somehow generated from the base alien designs, not each individually painstakingly thought out. An element I'd entirely forgotten until looking back into this for the sake of this video were the codes. You get access to each alien transformation through these codes that came with the battle version toy line of Ben's original aliens plus 2 others. Really clever way to go about it. It really makes each fusion feel so earned and sort of mysterious if you don't have all the codes. Also a great way to drive sales of that series of toys. Though in my case, not having any idea about all that, didn't even know the toys existed really, I just found all the codes on whatever website I stumbled across at the time. I must have just assumed I couldn't find this batch of codes, but turns out for whatever reason, Ripjaws along with Waybig, Ditto, Arcticuana, Eye-Guy, Buzzshock and Spitter were just never included. But somehow and for whatever reason, Vilgax and Gwen made it to the list, though these two, despite being in the fusion game, can't actually become hybrids whatsoever. The one that really stood out to me as a kid and even now triggers a Ratatouille-like experience were the fusions of Blitzwolfer and Diamond Head, along with Cannonbolt and Ghost Freak, since the purple details always really reminded me of Frieza. Just realising now there's 2 Dragon Ball mentions in this video. That, along with pretty much any upgrade transformation, has remained somewhere deep within my memory. Looking at them now, I'm discovering this newfound love for fusions like Upgrade and Snero, Stinkfly and Wildmutt, as well as Grey Matter and Cannonbolt, as goofy as that one looks. And from Dr. Animo and the Mutant Ray, as well as from this game, came seemingly endless amounts of fan-made Omnitrix alien fusions. I see new ones popping up just about every day. Especially if you include all the fan-made amalgam forms people have come up with, either giving their own take on Kevin's classic amalgam form, Kevin 11,000's form, or any amalgam iteration we see later in the following series. These amalgams have always been my personal favourite fusions, but the regular fusions are pretty great themselves. Though something about the individual pieces of an alien making up these distinct segments of the fusion is so appealing to me. While I'm on this, the Ink Tank have an absolutely flawless video discussing fusions with OR Ash, where Ash breaks down different types of fusions. I'll link that in the description. But as a quick TLDR, fusions tend to fall into one of 4 categories. There's reskins, where one of the 2 characters being fused works as a sort of texture that applies to the other character they're fused with. Then there's Frankenstein style, or what I'd call an amalgam, with those individual bits and pieces being distinct enough from one another. Then there's hybrid style, which is a more cohesive, smooth form of fusion that feels like an entirely new creation of its own. And finally, Foster style, which, credit to Ash here especially with this one, I would have never thought of as its own distinct style that pushes things further than hybrids, where the fusion becomes greater than the sum of its 2 parts, really carving out their own distinct designs, separate from the 2 characters or components. Now that we've covered fusions more generally, let's continue our walk down memory lane to Season 2's episode of the classic series. But before we get into that, if you like this style of content, please consider subscribing, and if you already are, great, let's get back into it. In the episode Dr. Animo and the Mutant Ray, in an effort to unlock a new alien species, or just several new alien species, Ben damages the Omnitrix, resulting in a series of fusion aliens. Being, as you might imagine, our first instance of fusions, which, as we've discussed at some length now, led to the DNA Lab, along with the seemingly never-ending community-made alien hybrids. Back to the episode itself though, after managing to break off a piece of the Omnitrix, that piece starts going a bit haywire, affecting the wildlife around it and creating these sort of stinkfly worms. And pretty much right after we're introduced to those, we get Ben activating the Omnitrix in a fight against Animo, and we get introduced to alien fusions with stink arms. As the name suggests, being a hybrid of Stinkfly and Forearms, who is a nice example of the hybrid style fusion we talked about earlier. There's something so cohesive about the way Stinkfly's tail and wings lend themselves to Forearms' more hulking proportions. Beyond the visuals, what I love about this fusion and the fusions in this episode generally are the limitations that come with being badly suited for one another. You can kind of view this in one of 2 ways. You can see them as two species that aren't compatible, or you can view it that the device just isn't fusing them in the most optimal way that could make them more functional transformations, seeing as it's not exactly an intended feature of this device. A flaw that we'll see addressed later in this video when we get to the biometrics. This less than stellar combination results in a pretty major strength decrease due to stinkfly's anatomy, and at the same time a major limitation to flight, due to this fusion's massive weight and size difference that stinkfly's wings aren't exactly built to support, meaning that he's both weaker than forearms and significantly worse at flying than stinkfly. This will also be a pattern that follows the next two transformations in this episode. We also get a stinkfly crab hybrid, which leads to a life-altering point for Animo, who rather than just creating mutants, now wants to create alien hybrids using the DNA stored inside the Omnitrix, though for now just the faceplate from the Omnitrix is enough. Moving on, we get this really nifty Heat Blast bat hybrid. As much as I like the look of this fusion, it never really made too much sense to me as to why it became so massive. Though thinking about it now, I suppose it makes sense seeing as all of Dr. Animo's mutants tend to be pretty large. Maybe it's the regular mutation process plus Heat Blast's DNA as opposed to just being crossed with Heat Blast. This then leads to a confrontation between the Bat and Ben, introducing us briefly to Diamond Matter. Again, as the name suggests, a fusion between Diamond Head and Grey Matter, who is once again not as strong or as durable as Diamond Head, while losing any advantage Grey Matter had by being smaller. Though I don't think he's mentioned to be less intelligent than Grey Matter, but it feels like a reasonable conclusion to make. Of the three fusions introduced here, he's not my absolute favourite, especially the first time I watched this in 2006 or so, but I have softened on him since. A bit yuck, but next we have this Max Slug hybrid. It feels like the worst bits of Stinkfly mixed in here. But seeing that yucky hybrid makes Ben retaliate with my favourite of this episode with Heat Jaws, who nicely fits the amalgam style. Beyond just preferring the amalgam style, I love seeing it with these two species since they're so opposed from one another that they couldn't reasonably have a cohesive fusion. More than the last two fusions, this hybrid is an absolute mess. His Heat Blast side dehydrates him, forcing him to need to be in water, while massively weakening his Heat Blast side while being in that water. Though he does manage to use his Heat Blast abilities to a reasonable extent despite all of that. Jumping forward around 7 years, come Omniverse, we get our new series iteration of Ben 10,000, who for whatever reason decided fusions were the way to go. As such, this Ben uses the biometrics, made up of two individual Omnitrixes that are linked to one another, allowing him to fuse alien species together. I suppose seeing as that's the case, he could in theory just use one at a time if he weren't after turning into a fusion, but we never see that. Something I found out while researching for this video, which in itself has become something I probably average saying at least once a video, is that this version of Ben is supposed to be a representation of the Ben 10,000 that learnt his lesson to lighten up and have fun. Just like the classic series Ben 10,000, only this time, the answer to having fun was a fun new gimmick. So let's go over his on-screen hybrid transformations, the off-screen confirmed transformations, and then do a bit of a lightning round of the concept ideas that weren't used in the series at all, some of which I found particularly amusing. But before that, what I like about this design, and something I briefly touched on earlier, it's tailor-made to fuse aliens. This isn't an incidental byproduct. These alien fusions take presumably the best bits of both worlds and combine them in a cohesive way, creating a fully realised alien that isn't just a fun-looking, weaker version of its components. In saying that, the first one we will discuss is kind of an exception, but we'll get into that. Atomic X, as I'm sure you most likely know, is a hybrid of Atomics and Alien X, which is inherently less effective than Alien X, seeing as he can be affected by the Chronosapien time bomb when presumably Alien X never would be, which you'd probably pretty safely assume means you're losing a lot of what makes Alien X Alien X. I understand the benefit is that this fusion allows you to disregard Bellicus and Serena, allowing you to warp reality with a Celestial Sapien part, but seems to lose the godlike and vulnerability that comes from that part. My rationalization for this, at least now, is that diluting down that part of Alien X allows you to access his powers without the ease. So while you can warp reality, you might not have the innate instincts to do so, being more limited by whatever level of comprehension Atomic species or you have. I feel this could be a video in itself, but let's move on for today. Big Chuck is great. I'm not absolutely crazy about the design, but an Upchuck and Way Big fusion is a bit of fun, just a bit more effective version of Upchuck. Crashhopper is also a bit of fun. Giving alien like Shock Squatch the maneuverability of Crashhopper is great. I don't mind the design either. Formungasaur, as the name so clearly suggests, is the epitome of a big, strong guy alien. I feel like this is probably the most cohesive, boiled-down representation of Ben's favoritism, unless you included feedback. I imagine after first building the Biometrics, this was the go-to. Uprig is great, but a bit redundant. At first, it feels like you don't really get any particular advantage by adding Jerry-Rig to upgrade, but I suppose it allows more creative thinking with upgrading machinery, almost like the opposite of combining Alien X and Atomics. You're not limiting this fusion's thinking, you're expanding on what it could create. Then we've got an odd one in Humungoopsaur, who just feels like a more goop. A great example of the reskin style of fusion, it really just feels like a larger, assumably stronger goop with the ability to grow, though Way Goop or Goop Big would probably be a more effective version of the same thing. Moving on, we've got the start of our confirmed but not accessed transformations in Diamond Mutt. At this stage, I'll stop mentioning every single component, at least until we get to the purely conceptual fusions. Diamond Matter being a nice little callback to Ben's original fusion, though I imagine now they're functioning more seamlessly. I imagine the visual wouldn't be all too different, but if you could just functionally have a Galvan brain in a Petrosapien, that'd be pretty effective. That along with Heat Jaws and Stink Arms being confirmed, I'm sure they'd just be more functional with the biometrics. Next up is Gravidactyl. I feel the need to mention this is Astrodactyl and Gravitac. Really fun pairing, not one I would have really thought of. And finally, for the confirmed off-screen aliens, we've got XLRG and XLR Freak. Both being, funnily enough, Accelerate fusions likely for the sake of the fun naming convention. A bit of a weird listicle, but I hope I've still got your attention here. Let's go over the concept alien fusion ideas that weren't used. Alien Blocks, fun name, the spelling is how you'd assume. Alien W and Alien X and the worst combination. Really feels so far like these concepts were just them having a bit of fun. Armadillo, probably my favourite so far. Bullmadrillo and Armadillo Bullfrag fusion. Clock Squatch, I'm not too fussed on. Clocktomics, I would have loved to see this one for the visuals alone. Echo Ditto, love the name, love the concept. Echo Storm, Frankenhead. Freak Chill, a real standout name. Gut Chuck, feels super effective, would have loved to see this. Gut Spin, Heat Mix, Nano Big, which surely should have made it in. Pesk Mungo Dust, again, I would have loved to see this. Rig Chill, Ripper Trout, great. Toe Dust, this would have been true nightmare fuel. Upchill, and finally Worster Trout, who absolutely should have made it in. This end bit especially has been a lot of me talking nonsense, but I'd love your opinions on some of these official alien fusion concepts. There's something about the way that fusions are so intrinsically linked to Ben 10, especially with how they've changed from Classic to Omniverse. There's a real through line there, and it's a great showing of Omniverse's celebration of all things that came before it, bringing back fan favourite elements like Ultimates or fusions in a big way. Just before we wrap things up, I almost forgot the Alien Creation Chamber. I'm not all too familiar, but maybe I'll have to touch on it in a future video. If you have any thoughts or feelings on anything you'd like to share, please let me know. Otherwise, if you've made it to this point in the video and you're not subscribed, I'd really appreciate that. Thanks for watching.